This conference will now be recorded.
Cool. All right. Well, sorry for the slight technical difficulties. We're getting started here. Welcome to the ESIP Interoperable Information Technology and Interoperability webinar series, also known as the ESIP Tech Dives. This one was brought together a little bit last minute, thanks to Rich Signell for making the connection. I'm really excited to get an update on this work. I was familiar with it a couple of years ago, and it was really just getting going. And I know they've been doing some really cool stuff. So welcome to Josh and Dennis to the webinar, and thank you for being willing to give the talk on kind of late notice. And I'll let you take it away. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, David, and thanks for the opportunity to speak with this group. My name is Dennis Walworth. I'm the data manager for US Geological Survey Alaska Science Center, and I'd like to present also Josh Bradley. He's a data manager for the US Fish and Wildlife Service in the Alaska region. And so we're going to talk about an open source metadata toolkit that we've been working on for some time, as David indicated. You want to push the next slide, Josh?
Yeah.
So in this talk, we'll give a little bit of background on the project, how it got started, and then we're really going to kind of go in depth into the architecture of the toolkit, kind of show you what the tools are and what they do. And then we want to talk about some use cases on how the tools can be used in implementing kind of a metadata authoring strategy within an organization. Next slide. So this effort came out of a group called the Alaska Data Integration Working Group, or ADIwg, and this was formed several years ago in Alaska, and it's made up of a number of organizations with research activities, both federal, state, and NGOs. And it was formed originally to look at barriers. How can we break down barriers between sharing information and data between organizations so that we can achieve kind of a higher degree of communication and coordination in research activities? So really kind of one of the first efforts we did was really looking at a project data exchange standard that we developed based on FGDC that allowed us to share information about who's doing what and where on the landscape. And so we developed that several years ago. We developed the specification, and everyone developed web services to basically provide their project records to members. So kind of a next effort we took was thinking about metadata, and we were, because of our location, a lot of international collaborations, we just really realized that we needed to be moving as a group to ISO. And so we thought about it didn't make any sense for everyone to try to figure out ISO and figure out how to figure out an implementation strategy. So we thought if we could kind of develop this together, kind of a set of tools that really sort of float everyone's boat, so to speak, kind of solve it one time for everyone was kind of our approach to it. So that's how this mdToolkit kind of got started. Next slide, please. So there are really kind of a number of challenges with all the various metadata standards and tools. And so really kind of the problem we have is that all these things change over time. And so how do we deal with that? And then we really just have the complexity, particularly with ISO. On the one hand, we have the robustness of the standard, so we can describe things we didn't used to be able to describe in FGDC. So there's kind of this challenge between how do we take advantage of all that capability, but at at the same time trying to provide things and keep things simple for authors. And so, you know, on the one hand, we want to be able to have this architecture that people can work with the standards in many different ways, but on the other hand, there's also this end user aspect, is how do you make things simple for an end user? So these were kind of the ideas we were wrestling with as we moved into mdTools. Next slide, please. And another point that I want to add to that is all these standards change. So you end up within this kind of a, well, now we need to translate to a new version. And so how do you manage change over time was another aspect to that. So we came up with this toolkit idea of just being a suite of applications that would be both for end user as well as implementation of kind of a metadata solution within an organization. So again, I think the idea is to try to find ways to make this simple, both for organizations to implement ISO as well as for end user authors. And we'll talk about that more later in the conversation. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Josh, and Josh is going to describe what's in the toolkit. Josh?
Thanks, Dennis. So it sounds like from hearing you talk, there's a little bit of a delay on the slides. So if I get ahead of myself, just somebody holler at me, let me know. Looks like from the people, I recognize some names from people online. So this probably be a bit of a review for some folks, but hopefully you learn something new as well. I'm going to give an overview of the toolkit itself, go through all the components, and then, like Dennis said, get into some use case scenarios and describe some ways that the tools can be used both together and independently. So really the basis of the toolkit is what we call mdJSON schemas, which are schemas written in a JSON schema, using the JSON schema standard. And basically that describes the content, provides validation of the syntax and structure, and in some cases, you can also validate the content as well. So we came up with this interchange standard that we felt was simpler and easier to use than particularly ISO was our target, like Dennis mentioned. So we came up with the mdJSON as a way to, I guess, to be frank, to avoid having to write ISO and having to deal with ISO input and output, and when we were developing applications or web services or whatever. And so we still obviously needed to take our mdJSON and get it into ISO format, particularly up here in Alaska. We have a lot of international partners and catalogs that we interact with, and not only obviously did they not recognize mdJSON being something we had just developed, but they also aren't really don't recognize FGDC CSDGM, which was a standard for a long time here in the States. So we definitely had a need to go to ISO and also still be able to support FGDC CSDGM and other standards that were required by ADIwg members to output the different catalogs within their own organizations. So we developed the metadata translator, which is a Ruby application to take that information that's in JSON and convert it out into various formats. And that's kind of a great pipeline, for us, being developers. We can take our mdJSON, suck it out of a database, maybe run it through the translator and get our output. But we also recognize the need that, particularly in my organization, Fish and Wildlife Service, we don't have a lot of existing metadata. So we're still at the point of trying to get people to actually create the metadata. So we want a simpler way, an easier way for people to have to actually author the metadata. So the idea was to develop application that would allow them to do that. And so that's kind of what the MD editor is intended to be. We also have some other components, one of which is MD codes, which are code lists that we maintain based on ISO that we've extended for purposes of using an mdJSON and with mdJSON. And so this is really the three components I'm showing here. The MD editor, translator, and the output are really what end users are that aren't developers or aren't interested in like knowing the ins and outs and what's going on behind the scenes. This is kind of the route that they would be interested in. So I'll go into a little more detail about mdJSON schemas and mdJSON itself. Like I said, it's based on JSON, JavaScript object notation. We have the schemas fully define the mdJSON. So it's not a situation where we started with the schemas, and that's kind of, before we add anything to the mdJSON, we have to add it to the schema and get it defined. And so that really drives the development of the standard itself. They're extendable, so mdJSONs are pretty flexible. The schemas are flexible. JSON schema standard is flexible. By default, any validators you use will ignore any non-keyword content that's not defined or in the schema. So you can add if you have something you want to track locally in your mdJSON that's not in the schema, you can insert that into the JSON, and the validation process will essentially ignore it. So that's really helpful if you've ever want to add anything to an XML based standard like ISO or XDC, and if you put anything in there that you don't write an extension for, it's going to fail validation. So this is a little more flexible. It still allows you to be compliant, but also allows you to extend the standard without having to actually extend the official schemas. We also wanted to make it easy to extract spatial information, feature class extent feature information from the metadata. So we used just plain GeoJSON inside of mdJSON, so you can read it directly out into applications like Leaflet or open layers, or whatever you might be using to map your features. We also improve over time. We've been trying to improve compatibility with the existing standards. So version 2, we worked on improving compatibility with ISO 19115-3 or -1, however you want to refer to it. And then we're also work towards improving compatibility with FGD, CCS, EGM. And there's we're working on it, adding some more support for some parts of the standard, including a data quality section and acquisitions. I'll talk about that at the end. So the MD translator, talk a little bit about what it is, how it's put together, and what makes it flexible. So like I said, it provides it's a Ruby application. It provides a translation to existing metadata standards, and between existing metadata standards. And there's a command line interface available, as well as a web service that we host. And you can see kind of a demonstration of that over on the right with the screen capture. We refer to the architecture is built around as loosely coupled, so it's composed of what we call readers and writers, and they basically read and write to a common format. And any reader can output to any writer. So if somebody adds a new writer, anybody that can ingest their information with an existing reader can immediately use it. So the next slide shows a pretty simple overview of the translator itself, kind of the internals, shows all the readers and writers we currently support. So it helps the input. In the case of mdJSON, it'll run through the validation process. If you found something that's invalid, it'll give you back a error report. If it's valid, then it'll take that input and convert it into an internal format, which then the writers pick up and will convert that internal format into whatever you requested. So that ISO 19115-2 mdJSON is an HTML output, SBJSON, and we recently released the support for ISO 19115-1. So like I said, any of these things can be mixed and matched, so you can take any reader and mix it with any writer. So just to give an example of how this could work, if you say you have an MD editor, you're using that to create your mdJSON, you run it through the translator, get validation, and you ask for FGDC CSDGM, it outputs that. Conversely, you could, since we have an FGDC CSDGM reader, you can read that in and then output that as mdJSON, and you could edit that in the editor. And then you could convert it back in the FGDC CSDGM if you choose, or maintain it in mdJSON, or whatever other formats you need to that the translator supports. I will point out that most of the time, our users or people that are using the toolkit are maintaining their information in mdJSON. So essentially, once they convert it from FGDC or ISO or whatever they're using, and they get into mdJSON, that basically becomes the storage format. And then the rest of the translations are basically as needed, but it's maintained in mdJSON. One reason you want to do that, in particular, especially if you're dealing with FGDC CSDGM, and even if you're dealing with ISO, is that mdJSON supports this superset of things, especially with respect to CSDGM. Not so much with ISO, just because it's so big, but it does have components in it that ISO does not support. So if you don't maintain the mdJSON, then you can potentially lose some of that information. So MD codes is kind of the last component that was in the overview. And I'll talk about that with reference to what we call mdTools. mdTools is basically, we developed it to document the mdJSON. That's kind of how it started. And so essentially it turned into an interactive documentation view, so you can go view the structure of the mdJSON schemas. It gives you examples, mappings to other standards, and you can actually view the schemas directly in that application or from the application. It also has a validator built into it, which does client-side validation using the schemas in it on your mdJSON. It also has an interface that interfaces with the MD translator web service, which allows you to translate back and forth between anything that the MD translator supports. And then, like I mentioned, the code lists are available as well in a couple different formats. And those code lists make up many of the menu items or menu lists in the editor. So they're directly used in the editor, which is the next component up that I'm going to go over. So, like I said, it's a web application. It's built using the Ember.js JavaScript framework. It uses Bootstrap for the CSS, the styling, and there's a bunch of other open source components that go into the editor. And it's really, give my pitch for open source software. There's no way we would have been able to create this application with the limited resources that we have available in the limited time and staff that contribute to this without using open source software. It's really built, much of the work is behind the scenes, built on open source libraries. So yay, open source. So by default, the editor only stores your data locally. It won't send anything to any database or any server unless you ask it to. It does this by currently utilizes local storage in your browser. So if you refresh your browser, you won't lose your information. However, if you clear your cache, you can lose your information. So we also have the ability to import and export to local file system, which I'll talk about a little more in depth in a second. So it also has built-in validation and error reports, utilizes the mdJSON schemas directly to do validation, and it has an error reporting feature which dynamically is updated continuously in real time. So when you make a change, it'll update the error report immediately. You can manage multiple records, and you can manage the relationship between those records. So for our use case, we tend to manage things by project. And one of the things that we want to develop in mdJSON for, one of the key goals was to be able to write metadata for projects, which hadn't really been a focus of any other standards. You can kind of squeeze some project information into FGC, I guess, if you wanted to. ISO is a little bit easier just because it's more verbose and has more components, and it's just a bigger standard. But there's still things that don't fit in ISO, such as funding and things like that. So we wanted to be able to track our project information in the mdJSON. We also need to maintain a relationship with our products. So the editor allows you to define that relationship between your projects and products in the metadata. It also allows you to reuse your records that you've entered in the editor. So the contacts, metadata records, data dictionaries can all be reused and associated with one another. There's integration with any translator web service, so you can translate between metadata standards right within the editor. In this instance, if you do this, it will send your metadata out to a third-party API running the MD editor service that then does translations and sends it back. That service, the location of that service is configurable in the editor, so you could run that MD translator web service internally or even from your local machine and just point it at that. And so then you basically would not have to depend on an external service. Like I mentioned, you can import and export from local file system. It supports selective import and export, so you can only import, say, one record, two records, or a record with its contacts or whatever. We tend to maintain our records in the editor by project, so we'll load everything per project, do what we need to do, and then export that project information and kind of keep it all bundled up together. But you're free to manage it however you want. Some people just leave everything in the editor. But the thing to remember is it's important to back up your information so you don't lose it when your cache gets cleared out. We also, one of the things we kind of realized was that we needed to support the idea of profiles. And so what our intention was to allow folks to customize the editor for a particular use case. So if you have a shapefile versus a report, obviously you have different requirements for the metadata. And by hiding or not showing parts of the form that are irrelevant to the data you're trying to document, you make it simpler for folks to enter the information in. And I'll talk about those profiles a little bit more later. So we also want to build in support for publishing to external catalogs. Right now, the only catalog supported is ScienceBase, but it will let you publish metadata directly to ScienceBase. You log in, select your metadata you want to export, and then hit a button, and it sends it off to ScienceBase. It creates a ScienceBase item. And there's some value-added features or convenience features that we tried to build in. One example of that is importing extents. So you can import shapefiles, KML, CSV, tab delimited into the editor, and it'll generate the extent and try to extract the field information or properties, feature properties if you can. So we kind of have with the toolkit, we're trying to hit a wide audience. On one side we have a developer audience, which would be interested in maybe integrating the tools into an existing system, using mdJSON without worrying about the editor, just as a interchange format or data standard itself. Extending the schemas, and then also you could use the translator without using mdJSON. It's not really necessary to go through the step of converting mdJSON to use a translator. On the other side of the spectrum, we have kind of authors, people that aren't developers, that don't know anything about metadata, that just need something to be able to write the metadata content and get it to the right output. So obviously, that's where the editor falls in. Just you have a web browser, you can use it. And again, the custom profiles, you can simplify the user experience, and you can also share the information. So if you dump it out, export it out to the editor or JSON file, and you can send that to somebody, and they can open it up. They just go to the website, open up the file, and you can share your metadata content that way. So get into some case studies or use cases about how these components can be used, like I said, independently or together. This first one is looking at the LCC, Landscape Conservation Cooperative Network Science Catalog, which is a catalog that collates information from all 22 of the landscape conservation cooperatives, plus the network office. All the project information, all the data products, they're all associated together. The LCCs had really disparate levels of ability and support when it came to technical capabilities. So we needed to have a system and architecture that would support folks that didn't have anything, as well as folks that had a database they didn't want to re-enter anything. They want to be able to output their information from the database. So we ended up adopting mdJSON as the interchange format. So folks who use the editor, they can output that from the database. Sciencebase was our target destination for the metadata. They integrated the MD translator into their software stack. So we can send them mdJSON. They use it to convert it to SVJSON and import that SVJSON into Sciencebase. It also is used to translate the mdJSON into ISO 19115-2, which is then harvested by ADIwg, as well as outputting the mdJSON, making the mdJSON available for ingestion by our LCC Science Catalog website. So this is kind of an example of taking, essentially all the components and using them in an architecture where you go from basically nothing in the case of the folks using the editor or an existing system, in the case of folks with project tracking systems, and getting their output into mdJSON and then push through. Another use case would be if you have an existing metadata library that you would like to convert. You could use the MD translator to do so. It doesn't require you to convert to mdJSON. In this case, we have an FGDC reader available, so you can take the FGDC and convert it straight to ISO 1915-2 or ISO 1915-1 or SVJSON or mdJSON or HTML. So the translator could be integrated either via using a CLI or by installing a web server somewhere and pushing things to and from the web server from your existing system. So another example would be if you have source data, say you have data, like I mentioned, in a database, which I kind of described that situation a little bit with respect to the LCC architecture. Or you might have it in a spreadsheet or an Access database, or maybe you have it in some kind of a text file or whatever. These are all examples of taking information and then converting it in the JSON using various scripting languages and techniques. So just real briefly, the Google Sheet example essentially is a Node.js script that you can run that will go out and grab your Google Sheet information with Google Sheet. We've provided a template for our users, in this case, to fill out. So it kind of gave them a jump start on creating their metadata. So they can go through and fill out a lot of stuff really quickly. It supported, basic information about their projects and products, as well as their contacts. So they can go in and fill that spreadsheet out, and then the script will go through and harvest it out, convert it to the content, inject the content into basically an mdJSON template, and then they could open it up in the editor and complete their metadata entry. There's also a script that I've worked on with a couple of folks that you basically load into an Access database, run the script, and it generates a data dictionary for you based on the information in the Access database. So it'll capture relationships, indices, tables, fields, columns, properties, stuff like that. So as long as you define your comments in your Access database and comment on the fields and tables, it'll pull all that stuff out as well. So you get an entity attribute dictionary generated basically for free. And then it wraps in an MD editor record, so you can open it up and straight in an MD editor. And then, so kind of the last example is if you have a particular template or programming language that you like to use, it's fairly straightforward to build out chunks of mdJSON and then assemble those into a complete structure. So that's what we do in our project tracking system. We basically, I wrote a bunch of templates up that I can reuse over and over again, just inject the content into, and then the system takes those templates and compiles them into a full mdJSON record. So the nice thing about that is that you can take a modular approach, and you can, like, say, define a citation block and then fill that out with content. And if you want to change it later, you just update the citation or replace it with a different citation. Or you might have citations for different citations structures that you want to utilize in different situations. So fairly flexible. You can use this with ArcGIS. I'll say up front, your mileage may vary on this. I personally tend to have issues. Something always goes wrong when I try to import and export metadata from ArcGIS or ArcGIS Pro, whatever version you're using. But in theory, this should work by using FGDC CSDGM as an interchange format. And the reason I would recommend using that instead of 1915-2 or 1913-9 based XML is that way you can retain your entity attribute information. If you use -3, or it doesn't support -3, and if you use -2, that information is not captured because it's basically a separate file. So one benefit of this is they'll take advantage of auto-generated content by ArcGIS. So spatial reference information is automatically generated. If you have a shapefile, it'll generate or a geodatabase will generate the entity attribute section. So you can utilize all of that information from ArcGIS, convert it to FGDC, import it to the editor, and then do your editing in the editor, which in my opinion is much easier to use than the native ArcGIS editor. And then you can export it back into FGDC and pull it into ArcGIS. again, if I was to do this, I would just maintain my metadata from then on in the mdJSON, because you get a much richer metadata record than you would with just using the FGDC CSDGM. And you can also export it out to other formats, like I talked about. So another use case would be utilizing the mdJSON as a storage format in a database or in a system. You can natively store JSON in many databases, whether they're NoSQL or traditional relational database management system. Most of the major database vendors have a capability of storing JSON as a native format. Postgres, Oracle, MySQL, even SQLite has capability of utilizing JSON, and obviously MongoDB, CouchDB, that's the native JSON is the native format for the storage. So definitely would be supported there. You know, you can index it. You can then basically do whatever you need to do with it that you would normally do in a database. Generate information, put out the catalogs, websites, or other applications. And usually when folks are talking about NoSQL versus relational database, traditional SQL-based relational database management system, the concern is that you have this schemaless entity that you're basically putting into a database. You don't really have any control over, which is a benefit depending on what you're doing of a NoSQL system. But using the mdJSON schemas for validation, you can ensure that you maintain the structure. And you can write additional schemas to maintain any additional requirements that you have. So I think this is the last use case I have to talk about. Customizing the editor and the validation. Like I mentioned before, the concept of profiles, and we wanted to extend that to say, we have these predefined profiles, but you might have a use case where, I don't know, say for instance, you want to require a creation date for every single record, metadata record in your database or in your set of metadata. Or perhaps you want to require an email address, or you want to require a data dictionary for a particular type of data. The custom schemas allow you to do that. They're just JSON schemas that you could then you write the schema, and then you basically tell the editor where it is. It goes out and gets it, and then you can choose when and where to apply that. You can apply it globally, so it'll apply to everything, or you can apply it selectively by defining a custom profile. In the custom profile, you can assign a schema to a custom profile and then apply that to a metadata record, or apply that to a contact, or apply it to a data dictionary. So that covers custom validation. We also have what we call profile definitions, which you create a profile definition, and basically what that does is tell the editor how to configure itself, how to present itself to the end user. So you can show or hide a section of fields, a single field. You can rename sections. Eventually, you'll be able to provide custom help support information, so contextual help that shows up in the editor. You'll be able to define which things appear as required in the editor, so it can match your schema. So things like that. So there's a whole wealth of things that we could eventually do with the custom profiles. But you create a profile definition, you take your schemas, custom schemas as you've written, and you basically combine those in a custom profile, and those become available in the editor for users to select. And the nice thing about this is that you can create a set of schemas and then reuse those over and over in different profiles. So if you have, if you require, creation date and citation for a certain, number of data types, then you can write that profiles for each one of those because they all might have different requirements, and then reuse that one schema, combine it with other schemas over and over again. You kind of mix and match your validation with your profiles. So some things that we've completed and some things that we're still working on with respect to the project timeline. We have, like I mentioned, we have the FGDT CSDGM reader and writer just released the ISO 191.5-3 writer. In fact, it's not, if you go to look at the editor, it's not enabled in the editor yet. That'll be done shortly. We have a comprehensive user documentation for the MD editor that's currently in review, and you can actually access that now. There's a full tutorial section in there that I recommend to end users. We're working on the 1.0 release. Hopefully it'll be out by the beginning of the next fiscal year. Like I said, we're planning on, we are adding support for data quality, mdJSON and translator, support for acquisition and JSON and translator. And eventually those will make it into the editor as well. And one thing that has kind of come up over and over again is the question of, being able to write to a centralized database. We purposely started the process with the idea that that was going to be something that could possibly be added on in the future, and because we wanted to focus on something that was completely client-side, didn't have a whole bunch of server-side dependencies. But that's something that we're looking at adding in and possibly be available by the end of the year. So you'd be able to sync your metadata in your web applications, your MD editor in your web browser with the centralized database, and share that information with other folks essentially in real time. So these are some links to some of our sites, GitHub sites, issues. You get to the editor at mdeditor.org. There's a development version at dev.mdeditor.org. So that's the version that all the new features get pushed out to first. And I think in summary, this is just a summary slide. So we talked about the background, talked about the architecture implementation. Hopefully, folks that have seen presentations similar to this maybe learn something new. And with that, Dennis and I try to answer any questions anybody might have.
Excellent. Thank you so much. This is super impressive. And I guess knew this was the plan from a few years ago when I saw you guys kind of getting started, and looks like you've really executed well. That's great. This is fantastic to see. So the first question is, will you be able to share the slides somewhere? Do you have a place that you could post them?
Yeah, they're up on Google Docs right now, so I can send you the link.
Okay, well, we'll for sure get them linked into the IT&I wiki, so people have access to the links. There's a lot of links in here that I think a lot of people would want to have access to. So I guess with that, that's my only specific question. I would open up to anybody on the phone. You should be able to unmute yourself and ask questions if anybody has anything for Dennis or Josh.
Yeah, hi, this is Bob Downs. I'm just wondering whether you thought about having capabilities to export to a data site as well.
Yep, that actually came up not too long ago. And we talked about it when it came up, and it's certainly a possibility. It would just involve creating another writer and then output into the data site schema. Right now, our focus is on trying to get the support for acquisition and data quality out. So, but that's certainly something if there's a stated need. I mean, we've kind of been driven by like at least what we've been perceiving as the priorities for the folks that are either providing staffing or funding. So if that's something that is a priority or rises up to the top, yeah, for sure.
Thanks.
Hey Josh, this is Chris from Axiom. I want to say congratulations to you all because this has come so far since I last chatted with you guys a couple of years ago. It looks great. Tagging on to Bob's question, have you guys thought at all about exporting or creating a writer for EML? At Axiom, we've gotten involved with the LTR program and so are dealing with a lot more biological data or organizations that deal with biological data. So we've been thinking about it. And I wonder if you guys have had to think about it at all.
Yeah, it's actually come up. Thanks, Chris, for the question. And yeah, it's been a while since I talked to you. It's good to hear your voice. Yeah, I mean, we've had that come up a couple times. Again, same answer I would give to the data site thing. It just hasn't risen to the top of the priority list. But yeah, I mean, it certainly would be possible to create an EML writer for sure. And yeah, I mean, I'm not sure how much use EML is getting within the, say federal government, within the like DOI agencies in particular. But I mean, if that becomes a need, we certainly will look at it.
This is Dennis. I guess I'd add to that, and I don't know a lot about EML, so I can't say, but we would have to make sure that whatever elements, if there was anything that was in EML that's not necessarily in the other standards we support, we'd have to make sure that we support those components.
Yeah, so based on Staplewatch again, just based on those two questions, which are essentially, have you thought about adding the thing I need? Have you thought about how people might add things they need?
Yeah. Sorry, you can go ahead, Dennis. It sounded like you were going to jump in there.
No, go ahead, Josh.
Yeah. So the code is all up on GitHub. We are working, still working. Many of you might know Stan Smith or met Stan over at various times. But he used to be a USGS employee, and we contracted with him. He was basically one of the principal initiators of this project. He's since retired, but we're contracting with him to complete some of this work. And the intention is to update our developer documentation. We do have some of the developer documentation out right now. It's a little out of date, so it needs to be updated. But it essentially describes the internal format, the MD translator, which is really, kind of where you would start to understand like what you need to both read into and write out with respect to the reader and writer and how to construct those. It's basically going to take a little bit of Ruby programming knowledge, but you can probably, especially for stuff like EML, data site, There's lots of examples in our code base of writing out the XML. Essentially, it's a matter of mapping to that internal standard. So you have to map the ML, map data site to that, and then figuring out how to create a writer and get that output or read in. But once the mapping is probably the hardest part, is understanding the entire schema and then mapping to it, and then the actual programming is a lot of probably kind of boilerplate. Once you get the structure down, you're basically just building XML documents. So
cool, but you would be open to contribution if somebody had the Ruby chops and wanted to take the time to understand the schema.
Absolutely.
Cool.
That's excellent. In fact, if you want to contribute anything you want to contribute, if you we're completely open to that. We're looking for more developers. If anybody's interested in that, we would definitely welcome that.
Cool. And we got a question in the chat. Zaffer, Daphne, sorry if I mispronounced that. Says, thanks, great presentation. Is there a way to get a copy of the user handbook before the review is completed?
Yep, I will. Let's see, maybe I didn't include that. I think that's, let's see, doesn't look like it. Yeah, so I can provide that link to that. No problem.
Okay, so should Zaffer reach out to you directly?
I will put it up on the screen.
Hey Josh, I wondered if we might just add the link into the slide deck.
Yep, I can do that as well. I'll add it to the slide deck.
Cool.
I don't know if you might actually see that address, but I'll add it to the slide deck. I actually meant to do that and forgot about it.
Right, and that'll get posted to the website.
Yeah, and also if you go to mdEditor.org, there's a link to the documentation there as well. So you just go to the homepage, mdEditor homepage, and you can go down, click on Docs, and it'll take you right there. So there's a link to the user manual and the tutorial.
Excellent.
And yeah, if you're using, if anybody's reading that or using that and you have find any issues with it, then let us know. Like I said, it's still in review. So and it's a living document, so we'll be continually updating it.
Cool. Well, thank you so much. We are just about at our hour. Super helpful presentation. We got it recorded. We'll get that downloaded and pushed up to YouTube and share around to the email list as soon as I have time. And yeah, we'll be seeing you around. And I look forward to trying this out. So with that, I'll say goodbye and have a great afternoon and good weekend, and we'll see everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.